I'm working from the premise that we look at history and use a criteria for judging history that's completely unlike the criteria we use when kind of judging the way culture works on a day-to-day basis. So inevitably, people in the future look back at any given time period, and the ideas from that time period seem absurd. And I am forced to sort of conclude that it's going to happen to our time period too. I mean, the history of ideas, which is kind of a high-minded way of describing what this book is really the history of people being wrong. Hello. Thanks for coming. And thanks for paying $5 to come in. You know, I have to say, whenever there's a ticket, I immediately get slightly more nervous, okay? Because usually a book reading's in a store. It's free, okay? That means my talk has to be as good as nothing. As good as looking at a magazine rack or whatever. But as soon as money gets involved, I have to live up to that standard. Granted, this is only $5, so I need to be as good as like a pile of candy. But that's still something, you know? Also, we're being filmed, as they said, for like this YouTube archive or kind of their curation of various speakers they have in here, which, from my perspective, kind of creates an interesting risk-reward situation. The risk is that if I say something idiotic or insensitive, or I accidentally say something racist or something, it will go on to the internet and it will get passed around and go viral and it'll ruin my career. My writing life will be done, okay? The reward is that, like, now maybe some kid in Omaha will watch the first 40 seconds of this before continuing to look for pornography or like a live clip of Mastodon playing in London or something, you know? It'll be this intermediate thing he does before totally forgetting he ever saw me. So, the risk is all mine, but that's what I'm here for. Okay, this book is called But What If We're Wrong? The subtitle is Thinking About the Present as If It Were the Past. And in many ways, that explains what the book is. The book is the idea. It's an attempt to sort of think about the contemporary world, the way it will appear to someone in 100 or 300 or 1,000 years. I think that I'm working from the premise that we look at history and use a criteria for judging history that's completely unlike the criteria we use when kind of judging the way culture works on a day-to-day basis. So inevitably, people in the future look back at any given time period, and the ideas from that time period seem absurd. And I am forced to sort of conclude that it's going to happen to our time period too. I mean, the history of ideas, which is kind of a high-minded way of describing what this book is really the history of people being wrong. That's sort of what history is. People reinventing and reinterpreting events that didn't actually happen to them, and then deciding, well, this is actually what was significant, or this is actually what mattered, or this is what that period means. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read a little bit from the beginning of the book. I'm not going to read much because, let's face it, watching a person read is boring, okay? I know as a writer I'm supposed to be like, oh, you're here for the reading, you know, enjoy the mind of me, but that's not how it is. Reading's like a solitary thing you do in your mind. You're supposed to be by yourself, looking at the book, imagining the world the writer creates. You're not supposed to have the writer lecture to you unless you're like 3 and the book is go, dog, go. In which case, the reading is great. But what I'm mostly going to do is just sort of read the beginning of the book, which explains in a general sense what the idea is, maybe talk a couple of minutes more, and then take as many questions as I can. Because apparently it's like 7 o'clock, we're done, and a lot of times I get lots of questions, and I love that part. I love the fact that when I do readings, some people try to out-weird me, okay? They assume that because I'm obviously a weird person, that I must be thrilled when somebody shows that they are weirder than me. My answer to that is, go ahead and try, okay? It's not gonna work. One time, I was in Minneapolis, and I was actually, they had me do a talk on the craft of writing, okay? As if I'm an expert in this, I don't know why, I guess I wrote a book, that's enough. In this big room, talking about the craft of writing, a woman in the balcony asked a question, and she says, would I rather have hair for fingernails or fingernails for hair? Now, this is not technically a question about the craft of writing. So at first I was like, this is idiotic, and then as I was trying to describe to her that this was an idiotic thing to ask, I did think to myself, you know, if I had hair for fingernails, that kind of makes me like a lazy, limited werewolf. But if I have fingernails for hair, I'm like a human rhino. So that was a great question. Okay, so this is parts from the beginning of the book, essentially the introduction. Thanks again for coming. I've spent most of my life being wrong. Not about everything, just about most things. I mean, sometimes I get stuff right. I married the right person. I've never purchased life insurance as an investment. The first time undrafted free agent Tony Romo led a touchdown drive against the Giants on Monday Night Football, I told my roommate, I think this guy will have a decent career. At the New Year's Eve party in 2008, I predicted Michael Jackson would unexpectedly die within the next 12 months, an anecdote I shall casually recount at every New Year's Eve party I'll ever attend for the rest of my life. Now, obviously, Michael Jackson's death is a tragedy. He was a great artist, okay? I am in no way happy that Michael Jackson died. But that was an amazing thing I predicted. It still blows my mind. I don't know how I came up with it. We were passing around a notebook just writing down predictions. Some people were trying to be funny. Some people were trying to be serious. I guess I split the difference. And I said that Michael Jackson would die and there would be issues over his estate. And then, of course, many months later, when I was on a book tour, I was actually in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, when I found out Michael Jackson had died. Here again, I am not happy that Michael Jackson died. But I emailed a lot of people that day. But these are the exceptions. It is far, far easier for me to catalog the various things I've been wrong about. My insistence that I would never own a cell phone. The time I wagered $100 against $1 that Barack Obama would never become president or even receive the Democratic nomination. My 3-week obsession over the looming Y2K crisis, prompting me to hide bundles of cash, bottled water, and Oreo cookies throughout my 1-bedroom apartment in Akron, Ohio. At this point, my wrongness doesn't even surprise me. I almost anticipate it. Whenever people tell me I'm wrong about something, I might disagree with them in conversation, but in my mind, I assume their accusation is justified, even when I'm relatively certain they're wrong too. Yet these failures are the small potatoes. These micro moments of wrongness are personal. I assume the answer to something was A, but the true answer was B or C or D. Reasonable parties can disagree on the unknowable, and the passage of time slowly proves one party to be slightly more reasonable than the other. The stakes are low. If I'm wrong about something specific, it's usually my fault, and someone else is usually, but not totally, correct. But what about the things we're all wrong about? What about the ideas that are so accepted and internalized that we're not even in a position to question their fallibility? These are ideas so ingrained in the collective consciousness that it seems foolhardy to even wonder if they're potentially untrue. Sometimes these seem like questions only a child would ask, since children are not paralyzed by the pressures of consensus and common sense. It's a dissonance that creates the most unavoidable of intellectual paradoxes. When you ask smart people if they believe there are major ideas currently accepted by the culture at large that will eventually be proven false, they will say, well, of course, there must be. That phenomenon has been experienced by every generation who's ever lived since the dawn of human history. Yet offer those same people a laundry list of contemporary ideas that might fit that description, and they'll be tempted to reject them all. It is impossible to examine questions we refuse to ask. These are the big potatoes. What I'm basically saying is that if you go to somebody and you say this premise, it seems very obvious. Of course, there are ideas that we accept now that will seem absurd later. Everybody sort of reflexively assumes this makes sense. But if you give them specific examples of this, like real specific things, they'll just bristle and want to deny whatever the possibility may be. For example, If we went out on the street right now and we found somebody and we said, hey, random person, do you think it's possible that somebody we view as a great president now will eventually be seen as a subpar president? Can you imagine that the way we view presidents will change in 200 years or 100 years or even 25 years? That person will probably be like, sure, of course, it happens all the time. And then you say, okay, the person we're going to change our opinion about is Lincoln. They'll just think you're insane, right? They'll see like, why did you even propose this idea, even though they accept the core principle? It's just this interesting thing about human nature. We are ready to say that we're wrong about stuff, just as long as we don't have to be specific about it. So this book is kind of an attempt to deal with this in lots of different areas, okay? One of these areas is science, okay? One of the first people I interviewed for this book was kind of like a rock star string theory physicist named Brian Greene. Okay? I'm meeting with this guy in his office at Columbia. And the way I'm framing this discussion is that, hey, I'm not here to contradict your view of reality, because in all likelihood, your view of reality and mine are pretty similar. Like, this is not an attempt to disprove or attack current ideas. I'm just wondering about the possibility or likelihood that we're wrong about something fundamentally important. And then, kind of thinking I was being safe, I said, now I know, of course, some things are off the table. It's not like everything is up for debate. Like, I realize our understanding of gravity is pretty concrete. And he said, well, no, it's not. In 500 years, our view of gravity will be totally different in all likelihood. And that's when I thought, this book will work. If the thing I'm using as the unchangeable idea is changeable, I'm in good shape. And gravity is a very interesting thing. The initial idea or conception of gravity that we had was, maybe not the original idea, but the first one that was sort of widely known was from Aristotle, because it came from a period where science and philosophy were intertwined. And Aristotle's theory was like, well, the reason rocks don't float is because rocks want to be on the ground. They have agency. They want to be in the center of the universe. And of course, Earth is the center of the universe, so the dead center of the Earth must be the dead center of the universe. So if you drop a rock or you drop a brick or anything else, it's going to try to get to the center of the world. That's where it wants to be, but the ground stops it. Like, that's gravity. We thought this for 2,000 years. For about 2,000 years, this was seen as the best idea about gravity. Aristotle, a brilliant guy, wrong about everything almost, but he came up with really brilliant ideas. It was like he would just observe the world and say what he thought. This is before science changed. In the 1600s, with Newton, we kind of got into the idea of the scientific method. Science became more interlocked with mathematics, and everything sort of moved on from there. Then so Isaac Newton is sort of the source for our conception of gravity now. But that hasn't been that long, okay? It's been less than 400 years. And this brings up a whole bunch of questions that I can apply to lots of different areas in this book. 1. If mankind could believe something false was objectively true for 2,000 years, why do we reflexively assume that our current understanding of gravity, which we've embraced for a mere 350 years, will somehow exist forever? 2. Is it, however, possible that this type of problem has been solved? What if Newton's answer really is, more or less, the final answer and the only one we will ever need? In other words, what if we're right this time and we're at the end of knowledge? Because if that's true, it would mean we're at the end of a process that has defined the experience of being alive. It would mean certain intellectual quests would no longer be necessary. And that really changes the definition of what an intellectually curious person is or supposed to do. I mean, if we get to a point where we really are right, and this is the end, then what do we do if we're interested in the world? 3. Which statement is more reasonable to make? I believe gravity exists, or I'm 99.9% sure gravity exists. The second statement, obviously, is safer. But if we're going to acknowledge even the slightest possibility about being wrong about gravity, we're pretty much giving up on the possibility of being right about anything at all. One of the books I read while working on this one was by a woman named Catherine Schultz, who she's now kind of most famous. She won a Pulitzer Prize, actually, so she's very famous in circles where people know this. She wrote a story for the New Yorker about like the possibility of this coming earthquake in the Pacific Northwest that will be so cataclysmic that there'll be a tsunami, and basically Portland and Seattle and Olympia will just be poof, gone, you know. Very uncomfortable story for anyone who knows anyone living in Portland. But she wrote a book prior to this called Being Wrong. It's not really like this book, though. This book is about collective wrongness. Her book was about like specific personal wrongness, you know, making bad decisions in, you know, in relationships or in jobs or all these things, and kind of explaining how that happens. And she spends a few pages on the idea or the concept of naive realism. Okay. Now she notes that there's nobody out there saying like, I'm a naive realist, but that doesn't mean that they don't exist. I would actually go further than she does. I suspect that most conventionally intelligent people in this era are naive realists. And I think it might be the defining intellectual quality of this era. Now, the straightforward definition of naive realism doesn't seem that outlandish. It's a theory that suggests the world is exactly as it appears. Like a 2-year-old kid is a naive realist. If you put like a football on the stage and you ask a 2-year-old where the football is, he or she will go like, there. And then you put a bucket on the football and say like, where's the football? And they're like, football? Like if they can't see it, it doesn't exist. You have to be about 3 or 4 to understand the idea that something can be there just because you can't see it because of something in front of it. Okay. Obviously this viewpoint, if taken literally, creates a lot of opportunity for colossal wrongness. You know, it's like, well, the sun moves across the sky, so the sun must be orbiting the earth or whatever. But my personal characterization of naive realism is wider and more insidious. And when I'm talking about naive realism as like a defining cultural trait, this is what I'm kind of talking about. I think it operates as the manifestation of 2 ingrained beliefs. The first one is a person who says, when considering any question, I must be rational and logical to the point of dismissing any unverifiable data as preposterous. Okay? Basically the idea that I'm a logical person. All the subjective ideas you have, the speculation you have, I don't care. I only go by the facts. I make my decisions based on those facts. Yet at the same time, the person holding that idea also holds this in their mind as well. When considering any question, I'm going to assume that the information we currently have is all the information that will ever be available. This is the problem. This idea that we're only going to use logic, but we're also going to assume that everything that we know is all there is to know about this thing, and that's what our logic is founded on. Here's an extreme example. The possibility of life after death. Now, when considered rationally, there is no justification for believing that anything happens to anyone upon the moment of his or her death. There is no reasonable counter to the prospect of nothingness. Any anecdotal story about like floating toward a white light, or like when Shirley MacLaine would say she lived on Atlantis, or like the book where the little boy goes into a coma and he comes out of the coma and he's like, God's great. You know, it's like, all of these things are generally dismissed by secular intelligent people. It's just sort of like stories that people are making up to sell books or sell themselves or feel good about the idea that maybe life isn't limited. Okay. Yet this wholly logical position discounts the overwhelming likelihood that we currently don't know something critical about the experience of life, much less the conclusion of that experience. There are so many things we don't know about energy, or the way energy is transferred, or why energy, which can't be destroyed or created, exists at all. We can't truly conceive of the conditions of a multidimensional reality, even though we are probably already living in a multidimensional reality. We have a limited understanding of consciousness. We have a limited understanding of time, and the perception of time, and the possibility that all time is happening at once. So while it seems unrealistic to seriously consider the prospect of life after death, it seems equally naive to assume that our contemporary understanding of this phenomenon is remotely complete. We have no idea what we don't know, or what we'll eventually learn, or what might be true despite our perpetual inability to comprehend what that truth is. It is impossible to understand the world of today until today has become tomorrow. Now, this is no brilliant insight, and only a fool would disagree. But it's remarkable how habitually this truth is ignored. We constantly pretend our perception of the present day will not seem ludicrous in retrospect, simply because there doesn't appear to be any other option. But there is another option, and the option is this. We must start from the premise that, in all likelihood, we are already wrong. And not wrong in the sense that we are examining questions and coming out with incorrect conclusions, because most of our conclusions are reasoned and coherent. The problem is with the questions themselves. So, what this book is an attempt to sort of ask questions that a lot of people would not even see as potential things to question. Things that seem so standard that we just accept them and put us in jeopardy of one day seeming as though we were following something without even critically wondering if this thing we're following makes sense. Now, I go through subjective things and objective things, and there is a difference, obviously. There's a chapter on what is the possibility that the greatest author from this period is somebody, A, we don't know about at all, like a modern-day Kafka, this unknown person who will later be famous, or B, and this is a little weirder, the possibility that the greatest writer of this generation, in the eyes of future people, will be somebody that we are aware of, but do not take seriously. And maybe the writer themselves doesn't even take him or herself seriously. There's a section on rock music, with the idea that rock music is receding from the culture, which I think is pretty clearly already happening. And though that doesn't mean rock music is going to die, it will always exist in some way, it'll move out of the center of the culture and eventually become an academic pursuit. So in 300 years, rock music will be something that gets discussed in like a college classroom. There was this thing, this music, that sort of defined youth culture for the last half of the 20th century for this major superpower. And was this this meaningful art form that's now kind of gone. And the instructor will try to explain rock music the way we describe marching music to someone. Now, if we describe marching music to someone in this day and age in one or two sentences, we cite usually one person, John Philip Sousa. He's the only person who remains from this argument. All the other creators of marching music have sort of fallen by the wayside. He's the only one left, so he gets amplified and exaggerated. That will happen with rock music, in my opinion. There will be one artist left, and that artist's role and importance will be exaggerated. I talk about the idea of science. I'm not a scientist, so I don't really quibble about specific points. What I mainly talk about is the possibility that we could have, I guess, what would equate to like another Copernican revolution, where the entire way we think about science changes. There's a section about politics, really political science, I guess. There's a section about the future of football. There's a section about television with the idea that television has ended and died out completely, and people are looking back on it not as this dynamic medium, but as a dead medium. And what would they want to learn from watching television shows when no one watches television? And then I also talk about the possibility that, what if we are right? What if we're not wrong about these things and mankind is kind of built up to this point, and now we're at a place where our understanding of reality is the understanding of reality? What would that mean? So that's the book, okay? At this point, I'm going to start taking questions. If you want to ask questions about the book, that's great. However, don't feel like you have to ask a question about this book. You can ask about anything, okay? You paid $5. You have the freedom to say whatever you want, okay? And if there's no questions, I guess we'll just go home, but there already is one. So let's start, okay? Right down there.
I think you probably listened to this. You mentioned in your writing, here's what you think of trout mask replica.
Okay. He asked me what I think about Trout Mask Replica by the artist Captain Beefheart, okay? Now, I know why he's asking this question, though. Some of you are like, why do you ask that? There's a reason, okay? Trout Mask Replica is a record that no casual music fan, or I shouldn't say no, 99.9% of music fans would not find interesting, okay? They would say it's unlistenable or ridiculous or, perhaps pretentious or misguided, not even rock music. But in a small community, especially like in the music critic community of which I am part of, it has a real outsized meaning. In fact, it's kind of the go-to example of a record that the average person hates or doesn't even know about, but is actually this amazing thing. Now, I think what you're asking is like, could a record like that sort of become the singular thing that we remember about the rock era, if it actually maybe is the most intellectually interesting thing? Well, okay, it's possible, but if that happens, a lot of other things have to happen. That would mean that in a future world, the memory of rock music is of experimentation. That rock sort of existed for the person who exists on the fringe, for somebody who isn't into the idea of adulation and like arena rock and all these things, that was sort of ancillary to the creative nature of sort of the singular weirdo. So it could happen, but if that did happen, I think that would be a real inaccurate understanding of what rock music was. And this is always sort of the interesting question here. If we assume that this process I'm asserting is right, that as we move forward, there's a huge field of candidates, and candidates fall by the wayside, and one remains, and that becomes the definition, that would be an incredibly strange view on what rock meant to this culture. But could it happen? It totally could. I mean, almost more than any other medium, popular music is extremely vulnerable toward having a random idea become the central idea.
When you talk about categorizing your questions and the things you consider, you would seem like there's a lot of the questions that you talk about when there's an assumed answer, it's very like a culturally specific type of thing, right? And like if you went and looked at it from some other cultural perspective, there'd be an existing very different answer, right? That's proposed, and so it would seem like it would be hard to break down which are like sort of fundamental questions or which are cultural.
Okay, well, in terms of choosing what questions I pursued, I guess I used two motives, okay? One was, these are things that I think are sort of meaningful and up for debate, and the other one is like, they seem interesting to me. I mean, that's the thing about being a writer, right? You get to create your own reality. I start with a blank screen on the computer and I get to do it. That's why I do this. So yes, are you saying is there a subjective nature to what I selected? Absolutely. When I interviewed these people, the main thing that, when I interviewed somebody, I wasn't really asking them to tell me what we might be wrong about. I was actually hoping that they would provide the baseline for what is the conventional wisdom, okay? I wanted to get an understanding of, well, okay, having no other option, what is the most likely scenario? And then I kind of worked out the thing that might contradict it. And again, I'm not, this is not a book of predictions. I'm not going through this book saying like, okay, everyone thinks this and they're all wrong, but I'm right. No, that's not how it is. What I'm saying is I think I'm wrong too, but I'm just saying this is a different way to think about reality. That guy.
What was kind of the idea that started this idea, or what was the moment when this idea for the book first clicked in your head? And I know you just say you're not making predictions, but what is something that you think is the most likely that we're wrong about?
Well, okay, to answer the first question, it's like, these things always happen kind of in the same way, at least for me, like gradually and then suddenly, okay? First of all, I'm a weird person, like I said, so I think about the world in weird ways. Not so weird that I can't relate to an audience or that I can't write books that make money or whatever the case, but I'm weirder than like the person who doesn't really care, okay? So maybe it's just natural for me to do this. Another thing was I think I was unconsciously working on this book for 5 years before I even wrote it or even knew I was going to write it. I think that things were happening in my life and in my career and just sort of in the way I perceive things that were moving me in this direction, this idea that the criticism, because I'm fundamentally like a journalist and a critic, that there was something flawed with the criticism I was doing, not specifically me, but me and all my peers, okay? But then the more sort of like specific answer is, I was watching the reboot of Cosmos on Fox a couple of years ago, and I was fascinated by any story they had about a scientist who had been lost, or sort of misremembered or disremembered, just like unremembered, and yet this person maybe came up with an idea that contradicted what we had always thought in the past, and within one generation of their life, what they believed had become as if we had always thought that. And I was like, well, that must be happening all the time. That must be happening now. We just can't see it because we're inside the system. Coincidentally, while I was watching this, I was reading about Moby Dick on the internet. I wasn't reading Moby Dick, but I was reading about it. And sort of how Herman Melville wrote the book, and he was like, this is my masterwork. This is going to be my defining thing. And it came out and got mixed reviews and didn't sell that great and kind of ruined his life, and he became an alcoholic and he died. And then after World War I, there was a kind of a rediscovery and reinterpretation of Moby Dick, that this isn't just a good book, like this is the book. Like this is what a great American novel is supposed to be. It almost creates the idea of the great American novel. So the first thing is objective and the second thing is subjective. But in both cases, it was scenarios where in the present tense, we could not see what we would believe later. And that's kind of when I started. Right down there.
So you wrote an article about Abba and its Abba-ness.
Yeah.
Have you ever thought of that, Meshuggah is Meshuggah and the Meshuggah-ness, and maybe there's something about Sweden specifically because all these bands are very much that?
Okay, he's asking an interesting question. I had written once about Abba, this is in a previous book, and how, Abba was always sort of attacked by critics and not taken seriously, and yet Abba, relative to other bands from that period, are still pretty famous. In some ways, they're as famous as they were then, and they kind of, really happened in the 90s with like, there was Muriel's Wedding, and there was Reality Bites it was part of, this suddenly re-embrace of Abba, and one of my explanations for why this happened is because I just think Abba does something that is just at the center, only made by them. Like Abba makes Abba music. They don't make pop or rock or any of these things. They make music that is a representation of the idea of Abba. And he's saying, is it possible that other bands from Sweden are like this? That's not a bad argument. And it's not just Sweden, it really is Scandinavia. Because what happened was, during the 60s and 70s and 80s particularly, most popular music, rock and pop, came out of either the United States or England. And New York looked to London, and London looked to New York, and then LA emerged, so New York looked to LA, and LA looked to New York, and it was kind of this triangulation of things. And Scandinavia didn't do that. Like ABBA didn't do that. ABBA was interested in the Beatles and all that stuff, but they also had like their own separate language and all of these things. So I do think that it is more possible for a band to do something that's interesting to America in that way if they have less of a context for what Americanism is. So I think that's a very interesting point. Yeah.
When working on and researching, thinking about this book, did you come across any examples where it worked the other way around, where you found something you think we're absolutely correct about now, and in 100 years we'll be wrong about it?
Well, okay, what? Okay. The first thing I thought you were saying is like, did I find anything that I was like, you know what, we are right about this, but then you sort of added the twist at the end, that we're still wrong? I mean, my answer to this actually would be pretty much everything. Like everything in this book, when I give sort of the mainstream perception, the most likely perception, I would generally agree with that. Like in this chapter about rock and the memory of rock, like in a rational world, the answer is the Beatles. There's just no question about it. The Beatles should be the answer to this. Like the Beatles are the best representation of what rock is and what it became and everything about it. But the world is not rational. So that was always the way I was kind of working through this. It's like there's a rational answer, and then there's the acceptance that the only place a rational world exists is in our skull. You can be rational in your skull, but the world is chaotic and arbitrary. Yeah.
Thinking back to cosmos and gravity, the fundamental principles of the universe, do you think there is an infinite or a finite number of knowable things?
Okay, is there an infinite or a finite number of knowable things? Okay, I gotta ask this a follow-up. Okay. Do you mean, is there an infinite or finite number of things that we will learn or that can be learned? Wow, that's a great question. I suppose that really comes down to another kind of unknowable question, which is that does life exist outside of this planet or this galaxy, however you look at it? I mean, let's say that the only place in the universe there is real life. And when I mean by life, I don't mean like the literal definition, a cell, like the idea that there is civilization or all these things. You know? Well, then I guess there would be a finite amount. But I don't think most people believe that. I mean, I think there are many, many people who would say, like, there's no way aliens will ever come here and aliens have never came here. I'm kind of like that. But mathematically, it's sort of crazy to say that it's impossible for aliens to be somewhere, for life to be somewhere. And if there is life elsewhere, then the questions are limitless. I mean, there's a little section in this book, a short section, where I just sort of talk about the idea of infinity. And like, I don't know if humans actually have the ability to comprehend infinity. I mean, we can describe it, we can put it in a language, but I think the actual idea of infinity might be beyond the grasp of our mind. You know, just the idea of like, okay, I mentioned Brian Greene. He's this proponent of the multiverse theory, okay, one of many, okay. The multiverse theory is basically that we have a universe, but actually there are limitless universes beyond our own universe. He kind of described it like, imagine if we rolled out like a huge roll of bubble tape, you know, and one little bubble in that, you know, in that tape was our universe, and not our galaxy, but our whole universe. And every other little bubble was another universe, and it rolls on forever. When you first describe that, you're like, okay, I guess I can see that. I could see that there'd be a world that we exist in, a universe we exist in. Maybe beyond that universe there's another. But you throw infinity in there, and it gets crazy. Because infinity, everything that could happen does happen. Everything that could happen does happen. Which means there is another universe where everything in our universe has happened exactly how it is. Exactly, except I put this water there. Everything else is the same. There's also a universe where everything happened the way it happened here, but like one day on Christmas, Martin Luther King dropped a pen, and everything else is the same. But there is also a universe where everyone's a robotic dog. There is also a universe where there's no humans at all. And when you start really going through this, the possibility of what infinity would mean, it's kind of beyond our grasp. Okay, there.
Yeah, I read your New York Times piece, which sounds like it's based strongly on part of your book. And
It was adapted from my book, yeah.
so
They actually took a 10,000 word piece and made it to 3,000 words.
that was effective.
Yeah, okay.
Because that's, I have to confess, the first time I became familiar with your work.
That's not a big confession. I gotta say, I'm just familiar with your work tonight, so it's like, don't feel bad. You beat me by 2 weeks, you know?
So what I'm seeing is that you spent a lot of time in the world of criticism. You quoted someone in your article, in
Yeah.
your book, that said critics are actually very bad at influencing opinion of contemporary
Yeah.
art, but very good at determining what gets remembered. And I wondered if you see that as a failure of criticism, and what you're trying to do is reframe criticism so that it is more effective to influence our thinking in contemporary times rather than only retrospective.
Okay, well, the person who was saying this was a guy named Ted Goya, who's a musicologist. He kind of specializes in jazz, okay? And what you remember is close, but it's off by a bit. What I was saying is this. Critics don't have much influence on what is popular now. You know, the success of, say, Drake versus the success of, like, car seat headrest or whatever. It's like critics can sort of have an impact to about maybe 10,000 people, but it doesn't really matter that much in the sense. But
Trump Mass Replica being a good
that's another great example where many, many, many critics have written about that, and most people who've listened to that record are critics, you know. But what they are exceptionally well positioned to do is reintroduce records, okay? Or reintroduce films or reintroduce books. So the role the critic plays is important, but not so important in the present tense. It's important in the idea of sort of being able to go back into history and pull something into the present. Now, is this a failure of criticism? Well, I guess you could say yes, but the failure of criticism, if we're going to call this a failure, because you could just as well argue it's like, this is fine. It doesn't really matter. Maybe it's good that critics don't have influence on like what's popular in the mainstream. But the failure it made was that both in film and particularly in rock, although not as much in TV, but also and maybe not so much in books, is there was just this continual separation between the way a critic looked at something and the way an average person looked at something, and critics, instead of fighting that, sort of perpetuated it and amplified it. And that has made them, in a way, like they hurt their own effectiveness by trying to prove that their insights were more valuable, which is kind of a paradox, but it's easy to understand how that could happen. You know? Oh, what? What? Someone say?
Balcony.
Oh, balcony. Oh, sorry, you're right. Yeah. Oh, wow. Okay. Who said balcony? Do you have a question? If you said balcony, you get to ask the question. Okay.
My question is, what do you think about the hockey game tonight?
The hockey game tonight? Well, okay. I went to the University of North Dakota, which has got a great hockey program, but I liked college hockey. I have not watched an NHL game this season or in 10 years. I gotta say, that's just, I mean, I would be lying. I could have made up an answer. I know enough of what's going on that I could fake one, but I mean, like, I am a very intense football and basketball fan, but my relationship to baseball and hockey has sort of evaporated. Like, you know, I'm better suited to answer a question about track. Okay, so, the guy in the corner who looks bored, yeah.
On a sports note, will you please apologize to Tom Brady for us?
Okay, he's asking me to apologize for Tom Brady. First of all, no way, okay? Here, I knew somebody would ask me about this, okay? I mean, basically, I'll just explain what happened. Like, GQ asked me to do a story on Tom Brady for their Man of the Year issue. And I said, I only have one question for him. I don't want to ask him about his wife or his clothes, you know. I think he's the greatest quarterback of this era, potentially of all time, probably of all time, in fact. I have all these thoughts about him. I can write an essay about him, but if you want me to interview him, I got one thing to ask him about, and that will lead to my other questions. And they contact Tom Brady, who has many agents, okay? And maybe this agent, who might be fired now, he's told us, it's like, Tom wants to do this. He is ready to have this conversation, and he wants to have it with you. And I was like, are you sure? And they were like, yes. The agent, in fact, told, I'm not supposed to say this, I shouldn't say this. Okay, well, like, this agent basically said, like, this interview is gonna resonate around the world. And I was like, well, obviously he's gonna talk about this then. So I was like, sure, let me do it, that's great. Okay, so I'm supposed to go to Boston and talk to him, but it gets canceled. We reschedule, gets canceled again. Now the agent tells us he doesn't wanna look you in the eye when you have this conversation, which makes me think something very interesting is going to happen in this. So now it's by phone, and Tom calls me from his car on a Tuesday, and it is instantly clear that not only is he not gonna talk about this, him and this agent never talked about this. Like, he seemed authentically surprised that I was asking these questions. I mean, I can't believe he was totally surprised, but I do sense that I was misled. And they also kind of tricked us. That's too far. They didn't trick us, but they did the photo shoot before the interview. So now we had all these, if you remember them, very peculiar photos of Tom Brady in his house. And so, like, he's in the magazine now. Like, it's gonna happen. He's like on the cover, it's gonna happen. So here's what I thought would happen, okay? I knew that he had already been, like, deposed about this, and I thought that I would say, like, were you at all involved in Deflategate? And my assumption was that he would be like, well, of course not, no. And then I had a whole litany of questions that would come as response to that, okay? But he was like, I can't talk about it. I'm not talking about it. There's still a court case pending. There's still this trial pending. And you know, I get that, but here's the deal. That only matters if you're giving a different answer. Like, if I murder someone, if I'm accused of murdering someone, and I didn't do it, and the cops say, like, did you do it? And I'm like, no way. And they charge me anyways. And then there's a trial that's gonna happen, and 2 weeks before the trial, some reporter says, did you kill that guy? I would not be like, I can't comment. It's going to trial. I would say, no, I did not kill the person, okay? That's what I assumed would happen. So I have no apologies for that. And I also have to say, this is both, could be seen as a criticism, could be seen as a compliment. I used to think the craziest sports fans were in Philadelphia. I was always raised to believe that. It is nothing compared to Boston sports fans. This is the, see, it is a compliment to you. Like, yeah, I have never experienced people who viewed an athlete with such reverence. Like, how dare you ask him this question that is the obvious question to ask? You know, in Philadelphia, like, you know, they get in trouble, they threw batteries at Santa Claus in a football game. Santa Claus was there and the crowd threw batteries at him. If Tom Brady came out tomorrow and said, everybody in Boston should swallow AA batteries, some of the people at this one particular radio station, I can't remember what it was, if they said Tom Brady said this, all the hosts and the fan base would be swallowing batteries. The hospital would be filled with people getting their stomach pumped because of this. I just never experienced anything like it. You know, I have a relationship with Bill Simmons, and Bill Simmons always said, like, you know, being a Boston fan is different. You know, being a fan of the Boston is just different. And I was like, you're so full of shit. It's like everyone thinks that. Like, people in Las Vegas think this. People in, you know, Omaha think this. People in Oklahoma City, everyone thinks there's something special about being a fan from your community. But in this case, he was right. Yeah, just a couple more. Right there?
How will your work be read in 100 years?
How will my work be read in 100 years? Probably not at all. I mean, I'm just, like, of course I would like it to, but I mean, in all, like, to be honest, what will happen in all likelihood is that my work will be read as long as I am alive and producing it. And then I will die, and there will be 2 days on social media where a few people will be like, oh, he's dead. and a bunch of people who hated me during my life will be like, he was a defining part of my childhood, and all this made up stuff about how they're sad that I'm dead, and then no one will care. You know?
The world wasn't rational. I mean, you're not the Beatles, but what if you're the others?
Well, that would be great. That would be great, but also, do you really want to be the example of why the world is not rational? Like, I'd be like, oh, I feel good. Stupidly, people know who I am, you know? Okay. Donovan?
Do you think in 100 years your decision not to apologize to Tom Brady will be true?
Well, it will be interesting. It's like if Tom Brady, like, eventually becomes president, and like a world war breaks out, and Tom Brady is the leader who gets it through us based on his honesty. They'll go back and be like, look at this schmuck, you know? Okay, I'll think one more. That guy's got his arm up so straight. You.
All right, it's a bit of a two-parter, but they're related. The first is, of all the articles and books you've written, which idea or premise are you proudest of? And the second is, which idea or premise of those would you like to be remembered in 100 years?
Oh, that's a very interesting, kind of flattering question. What? Okay. This is a weird answer, but I did think of something immediately. In my very first book, at one point I compare side 2 of GNR Lies, the second Guns N' Roses record, to the Gospels. And no, but I know, but the idea is that how the Gospels were written at 4 different times in history, and the book of John actually contradicts the book of Mark in a way, and like in one book that there's like, you know, there's no like passion, and in the other one there's no despair, and I was like, the side 2 of GNR Lies is kind of like that. I gotta say, I thought it was a pretty good idea. Like it was like okay, let me rephrase it. I thought it was a idea, okay? And the one that you'd like, what would I like to be remembered for? One idea? Well,
hopefully not Tom Brady.
and hopefully not Saved by the Bell. Okay. Although there again, as I say it, I'm making fun of it. I wrote an essay about Saved by the Bell once, based on the premise that like, whatever art you're interested in, you can be interested in. It's how you think about it. It's not what it is. So maybe that's a good idea. Maybe that's the idea that I would like. If people said, like, you know what he did? He introduced the idea that it doesn't matter what art you're interested in. It matters what your interest is based on. Are you thinking critically about this thing? Are you thinking about it in a way that creates other ideas, regardless of the merits of the actual piece of art? I would feel good about that. And in fact, because I feel good, I'm ending this talk. Thank you very much.
Part of the thing I hope will happen from this book, other than it, you know, I originally set out to write like a sitcom, right? Like a comedy show, like another tech show, only it wouldn't be HBO, it'd be this kooky, crazy place with beanbag chairs and teddy bears, right? And you know, people getting graduated. And I thought that could be a really funny show. And I thought, and the book was originally just that. Like, and the old guy goes in, doesn't get it, you know, and half of the humor is just me being clueless and an idiot and making mistakes and not knowing how to behave, right? So, but then as I was writing it, I realized there is a bigger story, right? There is a bigger story about, like, wait a minute, there is this whole world where people over 40 or even younger are now told, like, we just don't need you and we don't want you.